Hey, what's up guys? I'm Dave Klein of Dave Control, and I wanted to talk to you guys about Dark Souls 3 because I was fortunate enough to attend E3 2015 where they were showing a behind-the-scenes kind of closed-doors demonstration of Dark Souls 3. So joining me was Soulbrand, Terramantis, Vadi Vidya, a German spy, and just a lot of members of the Souls community, so I highly recommend you check out their content when they post it. But I thought I'd give you guys the first impressions of what I got to see behind the closed doors, and just someone from, Souls community member, kind of the things that I noticed. So I'm going to have listed down in the description kind of like quick links to the sections of how I decided to kind of segment the way I talk about this. So I hope that ends up helping you guys guide through it. So I should probably explain exactly how this worked. And essentially we had a little PowerPoint presentation by Hidetaka Miyazaki himself. And then after the PowerPoint presentation, there was an actual hands-off gameplay demonstration where there was a demoer playing the game in the back as Hidetaka Miyazaki commentated over it. And then after that, there was a live Q&A. And then after that, I had a chance to actually do a one-on-one interview with Hidetaka Miyazaki, which is already posted on my channel. So I'm going to try to talk about my impressions based off of all of this and the trailer that was also unveiled. So my first impressions of this were that the gameplay just overall seems a lot like Dark Souls 1. Even just the way that the game kind of looks is Dark Souls 1. I mean, just something about it feels like Dark Souls 1. And I'm going to try to go into depth for the various ways that this the reasons why this is. So, for me, one of the big deals with Dark Souls 2 was I didn't like the way that parrying felt. Just the timing of it's slightly different than Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne. I mean, Demon Souls is another beast in its own realm, but it looked like the timing was Dark Souls 1. And the other thing is that the riposte to the parry is the same as Dark Souls 1. So they're actually stabbing the victim through the stomach, as opposed to bashing into the ground, dancing around, and being like, hey, I bashed you to the ground, let me swap out my weapons 10 times and then stab you. It's just a straight-up immediate stab to the stomach right after the parry, which I actually like. The actual kick, the presenter, I think, did it by accident, but the kick, it's a kick. So instead of the slap that you do in Dark Souls 2, you're going to be kicking your enemy like Dark Souls 1. So I think things like this are what really makes it feel like Hidetaka Miyazaki is involved. I know some people don't think he really is that involved in the game, but stuff like this makes it really, really strongly seem like it is. Outside of himself saying that he's really strongly involved, just the feel of it is very Miyazaki-san when you think about it and compare it to Dark Souls 2. So it just definitely seems like Dark Souls 1 in a lot of ways. As far as some of the weapons are concerned, the bows were something that they really wanted to show off because they have now short bows and long bows act in different ways. And to me, this is the one element that really does transition over from Dark Souls 2, is a lot of the level of customization that you get from Dark Souls 2, and kind of some of the improvements that they did, like they were finally had moving around and shooting a bow in Dark Souls 2 was the big thing that they were trying to show off, right? So in Dark Souls 1, you have a short bow can do that, but a long bow can't. So with the short bow, it's actually even quicker. You can roll around and shoot while you're rolling, almost like guns in Bloodborne. Miyazaki compared it to Legolas. It's not quite that insane, but it really is a moving, shooting bowman with the short bow, which actually, for me, I'm not a bow build person typically, but it actually really interested me in trying out this build. However, longbows, you can't do this, and they're going to be a little bit stronger, and I assume have a larger range. That would be my guess, is a short bow is not going to have quite the range of a longbow, but that's yet to be seen. However, he did specify that you're going to have to stand still with a longbow, and it's going to be more powerful. So I guess it's almost like using a great bow compared to a short bow in a way, where the great bow is so much more powerful, but way slower. I would guess it kind of segments off like that. That would be my assumption. He showed off a number of different weapons, and one of the cool things that we got to see when they used the weapons were the way that they immediately started showing the moveset, which is something that people like us would be able to appreciate, like, oh yeah, like, they did the forward R2 and just showed that off while Hidetaka Miyazaki was talking about other things. So you could actually see the vast moveset. And something that's new, and I didn't talk about this in my interview, is the fighting arts. And the reason I didn't talk about it in my interview with Hidetaka Miyazaki or ask him about it was because we actually got to see the fighting arts in action during the demo and the presentation. So the way the fighting arts work is that apparently every weapon, or I'm assuming weapon class, I'm not sure which they said, but I would assume weapon class, has a different fighting art in the way that it works. So one of the ones that he showed us an example of was, I think it was a type of longsword, I'd assume a claymore, because this specific one goes into a stance that is the Guts stance. He specifically referenced Guts from Berserk, as everyone who's, well, I assume a lot of people who are Souls fans and Bloodborne fans might know, or if you watch Terramantis in my 10 things videos we've done that you didn't know inspired Dark Souls and Bloodborne, Miyazaki is a huge Berserk fan, and he very specifically said, this is the stance of Guts. So that is what he was trying to do in reference. So Guts gets in, or the Guts stance was like he wields his sword kind of to the side like this, and then springs forward and does this really heavy attack. So that was the one that specific weapon had. So it almost just kind of enhances the repertoire of the weapons. But that one, you have to sort of hold it and get into that stance. And that maybe charge it might make it more powerful. I'm honestly not sure. They didn't show us much. But I assume there's a way they try to balance it out with everything else. But kind of on the flip side is they showed off the falchion. And the fighting stance for the falchion, or the fighting arts, at least I think it's the fighting arts, was it does this crazy spinning attack. And it's actually a dual falchion, where there's one falchion in one hand and a falchion in the other hand, which was an alternate mode of the falchion. I'm not sure if it was the dual-wielded mode of the falchion, this specific falchion. It was a very specific type. Or if it was an alternate like fighting stance, or how exactly it worked, because they didn't quite say it, or I missed it. But this one did this crazy spinning attack where there were enemies coming, 2 from each side and then 1 from the end, so 5 enemies. And apparently the demoer had tried this, Miyazaki was telling us, in the first 2 demos before the one we got to see, and died trying this, but he pulled it off on ours and spun around and did this crazy spinning attack, hitting multiple enemies at once, which transitioned into another attack. So just really cool stuff with those dual falchions. But I think that's the fighting art of that one. But there was another specific weapon, fighting arts, that he showed us, which was another heavier weapon where it had this really quick move where you hit someone and then that transitioned into another attack with a heavier weapon. So I'm assuming fighting art is going to be very based on your weapon class, would be my assumption. And I think what it does is going to very much depend on the weapon itself. But essentially, think of it like another move set, or another move, not set, but another move to the move set of the weapons, and they're just calling it the fighting art. But I think of it like another move, essentially. The falchion, though, I should mention that he picked up and showed us. All the weapons were kind of normal in the sense of like you can one-hand it, then you can dual-wield it, and you have all your sets of moves like that. But the falchion almost worked like a trick weapon in Bloodborne, and I don't know if that was the purpose or how dual-wielding works. So he picked up this falchion, where he put, one falchion was on his side when it was like dual falchions, there were 2 of them, and one was kind of equipped to the side, and the other one he was holding in his hand. And he was attacking with the one in his hand, and then all of a sudden he switched to holding them in both hands. So I don't know if that just happens to be the dual-wielded mode, which it very well could be, but it almost seemed like the type of thing you'd do with a trick weapon. Which maybe that is what they were going for with it, but that was a pretty cool one that they showed off. Another thing that I asked about specifically during my interview, because I think Lobos Jr. had mentioned to me that he was really curious about this before my interview, and just like offhand, like he was really curious, so I kind of asked for him, which was that you use L3 to jump in Dark Souls 2 and you customize it for the jump, whereas it's B in Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls and Bloodborne. So I asked if that was going to be an option, because in Dark Souls 2 you can actually switch to B if you want. It is an option. By the way, when I keep on looking to my left is to make sure my audio is recording properly, if you guys are curious. But it's an option. It is an option. So he said that you can actually choose between L3 and B this time around, so they're making it like Dark Souls 2 in that sense. So I think there are things in Dark Souls 2 that actually were improvements that people don't. I know people like to bash on Dark Souls 2, but there are some things like that which are nice, like that customizability, and it seems like they're trying to implement that aspect of Dark Souls 2 into Dark Souls 3. Even though it very, very much feels like Dark Souls 1 mechanically, the customization of Dark Souls 2, I think, is what's being implemented in Dark Souls 3. So hopefully it'll end up being a best of both worlds, which is what I'm hoping for and what it would seem like. The game is 30 frames per second. Someone asked that during the Q&A, and Miyazaki kind of went, yeah, it's 30 frames per second. never ask me about that again. So it's 30 frames per second. Sorry guys, if you love 60 FPS, this is going to be a 30 FPS game. The Praise the Sun gesture is back, so that's pretty. That was fun. After the demoer beat one of the harder enemies that they were showing off, he did the Praise the Sun. He did that. It was great. And as far as platforms go that the game's being released on, the game is going to be released on Xbox One, PS4, and PC. That was during the PowerPoint thing. They listed PC. I don't know if it's going to be another thing where you have to wait a month. They haven't released any of those details as far as I know, but PC was listed. So I think that's really great news for a lot of you guys who don't have next-gen systems or like modding and things like that. I think, oh yeah, so there was a bonfire that they used that acted just like a normal bonfire. I know there's a lot of speculation with the guy that we've seen sort of leaked, and we saw there's actually a giant display of Dark Souls 3 at E3 where he'd stab the enemy who was in the ground with the sword, and then he's going like this and roaring over it, even though it looks like crying to me, but it looks like he's like, no, why? But there's this giant display at E3, and we didn't find out anything about that. And honestly, I wish I'd asked about it. I just didn't think of it for whatever reason. But we don't know how that mechanically is going to work. I know there were some speculations that maybe you create your own bonfire that way, or it might just have to be with, as the leak said, have to do with how you do PvP and all that. But unfortunately, he didn't cover it, and there was a normal bonfire. So I'd be surprised if you could create your own bonfire wherever you want. That seems kind of OP for a Souls game. I would be surprised, but there was a normal bonfire. So the other thing that was there, though, that was new, was there was this gravestone, which I'm going to actually talk about a little bit later because I think it might relate to the lore a little bit, but there was a gravestone that you could activate as well on top of a bonfire. So the next thing that I want to talk about is world and level design, and to me this is one of the most important aspects because the world, as much as I love the lore of the games, which I'm going to get into, the mechanics of the game and the level design I think are the strongest features. And I know a lot of people complained about the Dark Souls 2 level design being a little bit too linear and horizontal in level design, but Miyazaki has said, and he was quoted saying this during the Q&A, he said that he himself did the level design for Dark Souls 3. He wanted to have a hand in it. He did the level design. And for those of you who don't know, in the Bloodborne strategy guide, which Future Press did a fantastic job on, there was a really great Q&A in the back that Marcus or EMB headed up. And Miyazaki, during that interview, said that he was the one who does all the level design for Bloodborne. He was the one who did that, and that's his favorite thing to do in games. So I think that's super reassuring for Dark Souls 3 that Miyazaki was involved in the level design. And you can tell, even though we just saw one area, it was very well integrated with the vertical and horizontal level design, and this was something I was really trying to pay attention to, because to me that's a big deal, and part of what I liked so much about Bloodborne was I thought the level design was so great in that, and Dark Souls 1 and Demon's Souls as well, whereas Dark Souls 2 is lacking until the DLCs. It was very, very well integrated with vertical, horizontal level design. You're going in and out of rooms. You're traveling on the roofs of buildings and like going down. There's rafters for you to go down. So just really well done level design. Which, speaking of which, the name of the area that we got to see was the Wall of Lodoleth, I believe, and it to me kind of reminded me of Boletaria from Demon's Souls. It was this giant castle structure that you're climbing around and on top with towers and all of that. And you can climb around, so it reminded me pretty heavily of Boletaria. But apparently, according to Miyazaki, while he was giving the presentation, you can go into everything you can see. Now, should we take that with a grain of salt? Probably, but this is what Miyazaki said, is that you can go into every area you see. You see a tower in the distance, you can go into that. And he made a point of it a bunch of times. Like, had the demoer, look in the distance. He goes, see all that stuff? You can actually go into all of that and explore all of that. And then at a point later in the game, he was doing a shortcut, and he was like, by the way, we're running on the roof now, but all the rooms below us, you can go into and you can explore. So that seemed really important to him, so I'd like to believe it's true, and hopefully there's cool stuff for you to find. But, you know, it was a pretty massive map. It looks like Bloodborne in a lot of ways, and graphically in the way it looks, except for set in the Souls universe. So, yeah, that could be really cool if that's part of what it is. The hub of the game is something that I asked about. So during the Q&A, this was my question, and I asked them again in my interview. And I actually got 2 different answers, and I'm going to give you both of them, but I think the answer I got during my one-on-one interview is the correct answer. So I asked them if the hub, or if there was a hub, I should say. So specifically, if there be a hub like Demon Souls, or if it would be more like Dark Souls 1, where the world is entirely interconnected and there's no hub-like area, which for me is my preference, and I know some people prefer the hub and really like that aspect, but to me, my preference is I just like the interconnected world, and Firelink Shrine was just fine to me as a hub-like structure and area. But at first, in the Q&A session when I asked that, he said that it was like Dark Souls 1, and that was what they said. Then, when I asked them one-on-one, during my interview time, they said that it was interconnected like Dark Souls 1, however there would be a safe place like Bloodborne. So given that, I actually think that if I were to guess, I would say that that's the correct answer, and Dark Souls 1's interconnectivity is probably what they were thinking of whenever they say Dark Souls 1 and people ask that question, in the sense of there's an entire world that's completely interconnected, and probably unlike Dark Souls 2 where you go to branching paths, or more so Demon Souls where there's specific area locations that are completely separate. I think that's more of what they mean when they say that. So if he's comparing it, and he specifically said Bloodborne, if he's specifically comparing it to Bloodborne, I'd assume there's some area you can somehow get to that is not connected to all these other places, and then somehow you can then come back to the real interconnected area. Personally, I'd prefer if it was like Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 2. Or even more so. Well, Dark Souls 1 seems even more... Dark Souls 1 is more interconnected than Dark Souls 2, so specifically that, but I guess we'll wait to see. But Bloodborne, I think, is probably, if that's what they're saying, how, at least at the moment, it is. So, yeah, another thing with the world that was really cool is... Well, I guess I'll talk about with this for the next section, which is that enemies. So... We got to see a bunch of different enemy types, and a lot of them that they were just showing were basic hollows, and some larger knights that they were fighting off against. But some of the knights, the larger knights, were more reminiscent of Demon Souls, the enemies that are at the top of Boletaria, in the sense that these really more difficult enemies that you're going to get up to, and they're going to just feel like a challenge that you're going to have to get into, and really about that one-on-one combat that makes the Souls game so fun. Whereas there are these hollow waves, but not like Dark Souls 2, where that's kind of the crutch to make situations difficult. They tried to have it so enemy placement and then these more difficult enemies were what made the game difficult. And ambushes, they showed off a bunch of ambushes as well. But the 2 really specifically interesting enemies that they showed off, in my opinion, was we saw this dead dragon going up that they showed off and said, like, oh yeah, look, there's a dead dragon just hanging out. And then later on, they ran to an area where there were too many enemies, and they're like, what are we going to do? There's too many enemies. And this was a long pathway across like a bridge type of area, along like the top of a castle wall, essentially. So instead they went back and ran up the staircase portion of it, and then all of a sudden the dragon flew in and started spitting fire at all the enemies above, and started spitting fire at this top section. And then when the character would go down, the dragon would notice that your character had gone down, and then just start spitting fire at the bottom section, which took care of the enemies, but then also created the situation where you have to wait and time it out for when you can run across. Also similar to the dragon in Boletaria and that bridge. And Miyazaki's translator even joked that this is Miyazaki's favorite thing in Souls games, is doing this dragon at the beginning of the game. That's his absolute favorite thing, to screw over and kill players. So it was actually pretty funny. Like Miyazaki had a sense of humor, which was pretty cool to see. So I don't know, he just seemed like a really cool guy. But the other enemy that was really, really interesting was there was this enemy that looked like a normal character. And then when you ran up to it, all of a sudden this abyss stuff formed around. At least to me, it looked like an abyss type of thing. And the enemy transformed in front of you into this abyss-like enemy. And I think the other enemies around it either got sucked in or pushed away, but I think they got sucked into this abyss-like enemy. And it was like transforming in the middle of nowhere, and that was one of the things that they wanted to do, was surprise you. So just keep that element of surprise to make the games difficult. But it was just this really cool enemy. So that was the abyss presence is something that I definitely want to talk about when I get to the lore section. As far as the boss itself that we saw, the boss was called the Dancer of the Frigid Valley, and again, if I remember correctly, and it was yesterday at this point for when I saw it, but first there was this cutscene area where they go into this room and pick up a Soul of a Proud Knight. And then after they pick up a Soul of a Proud Knight in the corner, it's right by it's one of those things where it clearly seems to be where a boss might be, but they pick up a Proud Soul Knight, or Soul of a Proud Knight, and there's a statue there, right there, that's like, looks like he's trying to cut off his own head and commit suicide, and that was a really interesting statue, and I don't know what the implications of that are, but knowing Miyazaki, there probably are implications of that. And then all of a sudden the cutscene started, and you're looking at this statue, and you turn around, and then an abyss-like thing forms, and out of it comes this dancer of the Frigid Valley, who's this really weird, gangly monster. And I was doing a podcast with Soulbrand, which hopefully they're working on uploading tonight as I'm recording this footage. We might not have had good sound quality, which would suck, in which case they wouldn't post it, but all like the Soulbrand guys, Terra Mantis, and I were together, and the German Spy, to do a podcast, but someone had compared it to Voldo. And I think that's a really good description. It's very Voldo-like in the sense that it has these really strange attacks, it's very gangly and sort of creepy in that sense, and kind of delayed attacks, and that was a really, I don't know, it was better because it wasn't just another. It did have armor on, which I noted of like, oh, another boss, another knight in armor boss. But it was better than just another knight in armor. It was actually unique enough and different enough to feel more interesting, even though it had this armor on. So I thought the boss was really cool. And partway through, it switched modes, and that was supposed to be an important thing, that the more you fight enemies, all of a sudden they start having these more difficult attacks that they're going to do on you, kind of like Manus in Dark Souls 1 when he switches modes and he starts using dark magic on you. But it switches modes, and all of a sudden it starts using fire, and when it would do that, it would actually set the environment on fire. Like, fire formed there was carpeted ground, fire formed there and started raising up. Fire in the rafters and the pillars started coming up. So that was another thing that they really wanted to specifically point out. And speaking of fire, something that I forgot to mention while I was talking about the gameplay mechanics is they went into a dark room and made sure to show off that you can pull out a torch. And the lighting effects of the torch work, which I just kind of find funny at this point, especially after Dark Souls 2 when they showed that and then it didn't work. Now, the lighting with that works in Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin. It works with Bloodborne, so I would be very surprised if they showed us this build and then it doesn't end up working. Which, by the way, I think the build is a late alpha build. I think you said it was an alpha build, but I don't know, I just think that's kind of funny. But something else that's worth mentioning with this boss fight, outside of the fact that we got a little cutscene, which also didn't have that stupid blood coming in, which is, I hope they don't change. There was none of that blood stuff from Dark Souls 2. But there was no fog gate. So maybe it's more like Bloodborne, where there's not fog gates, unless this was just like one specific example. So that's one thing that I think is important to note. So PvP is the next topic that I've written down, and unfortunately there wasn't really much that we got to find out. However, two different people during the Q&A asked about soul levels and how that would, and soul memory, and how that would work. And this is another question during my interview. People were saying, why didn't you ask about soul memory? And it's because during the Q&A, I was part of people asked, and I wanted to talk about it here. So soul memory, from my understanding, it seems like it's out. In fact, Miyazaki, when someone asked about soul memory, the translator told Miyazaki soul memory, and Miyazaki seemed really confused. And then the translator asked the guy to clarify what he meant by soul memory. It almost seemed like Miyazaki didn't even know what soul memory was. So I don't think soul memory is going to be in it. I really just don't. But he did say it's going to be based off of soul leveling, but they were going to do something more with it. So I'm not sure exactly what that something more was, but it's going to be based off of soul leveling, but apparently there's another aspect to it. The other thing, too, is he made a point to say that there were dedicated servers for the PvP, so hopefully that'll work. That's all I can really comment on that. Hopefully it'll work. And then I think it was Ty, Dreaded Cone, if I remember correctly, who asked about Bell Maidens and if there were going to be Bell Maidens in Dark Souls 3 or something like that. And Miyazaki said that it was going to be like Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, and that there'd be summon signs, and you can summon enemies. Now, I don't know how invasions are going to work, and that's part of why I ended up asking later about it, but I'm not sure how, yeah, I don't know how invasions are going to work. I'm just checking my notes to see if there's anything I missed, but, I then went ahead and asked for my interview again just to make sure that there's nothing like Bell Maidens, because I really wanted to find out if you could essentially go in and invade someone whenever you want, like we love doing with the Souls games. So I tried to clarify even further, and Miyazaki said it wasn't going to be like Bloodborne, it'd be like Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2. And he didn't mention anything about Bell Maidens, but I think it's pretty safe to say that it'll probably be like the first two Souls games. Or the various Souls games, I should say, as opposed to Bloodborne, which I think for those of you who enjoy PvP, I think that's good. Especially, it's just, yeah, it's a good thing. As far as the lore is concerned, we actually got lots more to talk about than I thought we would, because honestly, people wanted me to talk about impressions from the trailer. And the reason that I didn't was because I wanted to wait until I could give you guys more impressions than just the trailer. Because when I see a trailer like that, the CG trailer, to me, I just think like, okay, the game's coming out. It doesn't excite me seeing a CG trailer, because you don't know what's going to be in it. You don't know what they're going to take out. Like the Dark Souls 2 CG trailer, the guys with masks weren't even in it. The dragon looked completely different. I mean, cool, the game's coming out, right? But there actually is a bunch in this trailer now after seeing the PowerPoint presentation and things like that actually are interesting and worth talking about. And there's even more that I got out that's out of the interview and out of the Q&A session in PowerPoint that's definitely worth talking about. So the first thing is in the trailer itself. Let's go ahead and talk about that guy at the end, who a lot of people were comparing and thought looked like the Giant Lord. At the end of the day, though, the important thing really is that in the PowerPoint presentation, unless I'm remembering this incorrectly, they referred to this boss as a Lord of Cinder. So it is a Lord of Cinder, which is important for a couple reasons. I said I wanted to talk about the gravestones again, and this is kind of what I was saving it for, is that with the gravestones, activating them has something to do with resurrecting the Lords of Cinder, and apparently, so I don't know what will happen if you choose not to activate gravestones, or if it's important, but that's kind of what those sort of act like, and I think that it's going to be lore. I think they'd said that there's going to be lore with each of those gravestones, too, so it's like the Bloodborne lore notes. I think I said that kind of Canadian, notes, or Minnesotan. The Bloodborne lore notes, I think, are going to be part here again, but with these gravestones. That is kind of what I gathered in my interpretation of that. But the thing is that apparently these lords are being summoned, and that's the thing behind them, is someone is summoning these Lords of Cinder back for some reason. So we also see this giant lord in the trailer that would seem to be the giant lord from Dark Souls 2. And as far as that goes, there's a couple things that you can note from it, which is, number one, it's coming out of a grave, and it would seem to be being resurrected, which is something that Miyazaki talked about, these Lords of Cinder being resurrected. And Miyazaki made a note in the presentation that there are multiple Lords of Cinder, and this guy is a Lord of Cinder, who are the people who have linked the flame. People, I'm saying, but the ones, I should say, who have linked the flame. So it would seem the Giant Lord from Dark Souls 2 maybe is someone who also linked the flame after Gwyn linked the flame initially. So that would indicate that possibly the Giant Lord from Dark Souls 2 is a Lord of Cinder, or it could just be another creature that looks a lot like the Giant Lord that linked the flame. But that would seem to be what we can get out of it, and you can clearly see that it's coming out of a grave, and that it was in a coffin, and it's coming out of the coffin. So that's kind of what we can get out of that bit, at least. And there also, as Miyazaki-san specified during my one-on-one interview, I was asking, like, hey, so the Lord of Light, who became the Lord of Cinder, is Gwyn, you know? So does that mean is this Gwyn that we're talking about here, or what exactly does this mean? And they really strongly wanted to specify, what we're trying to tell you guys is that there's not just a Lord of Cinder, are multiple Lords of Cinders, and these are the guys who have been linking the bonfire, who have been linking the flame. So when we think about this, right, we've been trying to figure out, hey, when does this game take place? that would tell you that there's at least been a number of cycles if there's multiple Lords of Cinders. God, I really hope I didn't lose all that. So my camera just shut off in the middle of doing that, so hopefully I didn't just lose everything, because that would really suck. So I'm going to try it, hopefully. So if there's this weird jarring, that's what it was, and I hope it doesn't mean I lost all the footage I was just filming, because that would be really poopy. So what's really important about that is that it kind of gives us a basis of what the timeline could be, which is that if there have been multiple Lords of Cinder, the timeline could be that multiple cycles must have taken place for there to be multiple Lords of Cinder, so it wouldn't be just like immediately after the reign of Gwyn. At least that would be the way that I take it. Although the other weird thing is that apparently the dragons I was talking about, they look kind of like stone to me, and this is something that I missed. But according to Franz, who can speak Japanese, he said Lord Miyazaki. He said Miyazaki-san said in Japanese, and also the translator said that this was a stone dragon. And you know, the lore of Dark Souls 1, that's incredibly important because the stone dragons were before the first flame. And then they all died. So, well, pretty much. At least the stone-scale dragons, because that was what was happening during the Age of Ancients. It was stone-scale dragons. So, that's pretty important, I would think. Other thing, too, with the trailer, though, back to the trailer, is the note of the faded embers that were mentioned during the trailer. And that means, you know, I mean, with the embers and all that stuff, it means a number of things. It could just be one of those things like the Souls games have been, that the Age of Fire is dying, and there's just basically, like, you gotta light up the flame, and it's basically gone. Or it could mean that this is actually the Age of Dark, and there's still kind of just embers there, and faded embers, but we're actually in the Age of Dark, and until someone lights up those embers again, we're just in the Age of Dark. And the other thing that's important about that, too, is Miyazaki made a point when they were doing the hands-on demo in the Wall of Lodolith that sun, there's a sun in the distance in that area, and the sun, he goes, is look at the sun. It's a faded sun. So that makes it seem like there's some significance to that, which would make it seem like it could be the Age of Dark. The other thing, when I was talking about the Abyss creatures, too, and the Abyss monsters, the Abyss, like, boss, if there's all this Abyss stuff related to the game, right, that, again, points to the direction of this really powerful Abyss existing even more so than in previous Souls games, where it's in areas that wouldn't normally seem Abyss-like. You have a fading sun, and this area that we saw, the Wall of Lodolith, it seems like an area straight out of Boletaria, where it's a sunny day, and you're on a castle, well, somewhat sunny day, you're on a castle wall, but it's a faded sun, and there's Abyss stuff happening all around you, so, or at least what I think of as Abyss. And now, again, this is kind of speculation. They never said Abyss, but this is kind of just what I gathered from watching it. I think I mentioned the gravestones. The other thing, and why I asked this, is that I asked specifically during my interview about the lore storytelling. And I asked if it's going to be told in the same way of the previous Souls games, where it's incredibly vague. And Miyazaki confirmed during my interview with him that it's going to be vague, and that it's going to be very much up to the player's interpretations, because it's my game. And again, this is a quote with Miyazaki saying that, you know, the importance of the fact that Miyazaki's involved in the project. He goes, this is my game, therefore it's going to be vague and be up to player's interpretation. The reason that I mentioned this specifically is because during the leak with the No, they said that there were all these cutscenes, like tons and tons of cutscenes, and people were talking about, like, well, does that mean the lore is just going to be handed to you? Is it going to be really easy? And is it going to just be a story that's told? Which, for me, liking the way that the lore structure is and the puzzle that it presents, I love that puzzle of the lore in the Souls games. I think that was an important question to ask, because I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be this spoon-fed story to you, and you do still put it together. I mean, it's nice when, you know, you get cutscenes and things like that, and I love the intro cutscene to Dark Souls 1. I think it's an awesome cutscene. It lays out the story for you, and it has way more significance than you realize at first when you go back and watch it, and you're like, oh my god, all this has so much meaning. But, you know, it's still nice to have that puzzle that you put together, and it sounds like that's what it's going to be. So, that kind of wraps up all my interpretations. I know this is a really long video, but I want to give you guys all the point-by-points of the things that I picked up, which is why like I wrote notes of everything. Well, I wrote kind of an outline of stuff that I wanted to talk about. So thank you guys for sticking around with me. If you did this whole time, I was just trying to lay out as much info as I can for you guys. So, you know, if you have questions, I'll do my best to answer all of your questions. I still have more E3 stuff to do throughout this week, but I will try my absolute best to answer your guys' questions. I really appreciate you guys watching. I hope I was able to answer what I could. For me, honestly, I kind of went into Dark Souls 3 a little bit skeptical, mainly because I don't really want this to be a yearly franchise for the sake of it makes it less exciting. Zelda to me is a really exciting franchise because every time they announce one, it's been like 4 years since the last game came out, so you're really excited about it. Or Uncharted is the same way. Whereas, personally, I actually really like the Call of Duty games. I know that's kind of controversial to say, but I actually really enjoy them. But they come out every fucking year, so it's like, I don't care when they come out, and I pick one up maybe every 4 years. So I was kind of worried that like this might become like that. And then with Dark Souls 2, I honestly really strongly prefer Dark Souls 1. Even more so over Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 2, and even over Bloodborne, which I really enjoy Bloodborne, but I just love Dark Souls 1 so much. And I was kind of like, well, how are they going to do Dark Souls 3? Is it going to be the whole B-Team thing, or like, what is it? So, even though I really like the Dark Souls 2 DLC, and I still like Dark Souls 2, it's a great game, it's just, you know, not as good as Dark Souls 1, but I'm honestly really excited, and I was more excited than I would be, and really the trailer, again, like, another reason I didn't really do a reaction video is because I watched the trailer and I was like, nah, it doesn't do much for me, but this gameplay presentation that I got to see, really, it was really good, and it made me really excited, and all the mechanics and stuff that I would have wanted out of a Dark Souls 2 are there, but all the cool features that they had in Dark Souls 2 that I think were improvements seem to be there for Dark Souls 3, so it could just be a case of the best of both worlds, which is really exciting. I do hope that the lore is more so than just another cyclical thing, and hopefully that's what it seems like they might be trying to do, is make something different and fresh, which I really hope for. But at least mechanically speaking and level design wise speaking, I think it looks great. I think it looks fantastic, and I'm really excited. And also do the Guts dance, because now that I've actually read all the Berserk manga and I'm caught up, I'm really into Berserk, so I'm like, I want to do that Guts dance. That looks sick. So honestly, like all of us Souls guys who went there were all like, oh, this actually looks really good. This looks really good, and I'm sure you're gonna get that impression from all of them as they start posting their videos. So I'm just lucky in that I live in LA, so I can, while they're in hotels, I can go home and work on videos. So definitely though, check out their videos if you haven't seen it. You know, if you want to, you can go ahead and check out my interview, which I had to kind of do in a weird way, which I'll have linked. And yeah, thank you guys so much for joining me again, and I really can't wait for you guys to actually get to see the gameplay and see why we're all so excited. So I'll see you guys next time. Later, guys. Peace. A year later, development began on Chrono Trigger, which is what inspired me to build this baby. A working time machine. See beyond our mind's eye that there is a way. A potential for humans to evolve beyond their natural limitations. Of course, you don't get to celebrate for too long, as it turns out your next task is to talk to this thing! Ah! I don't like it! So why flee to the undead crypt? It seems King Vendrick was trying to keep all of this away from Nashandra. His image of her painted in Dranglake Castle curses all who come near.